All right, welcome everyone to Building SaaS on AWS. My name is Christopher Logan, and I am a Senior Manager for Solutions Architecture here at AWS. Now, this is the show where we talk about the innovations, best practices, and many of the hows of how to build SaaS on AWS as we possibly can. Today's show is particularly about federated user identity. We have two wonderful guests on, Damika and Kartik. Damika is out of Singapore. Kartik is out of India. I will leave it to Damika to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me, and great to be here. My name is Damika Sriananda. I'm a senior architect here at AWS. My specialty is SaaS, and both Kartik and myself. We both are part of the global team called AWS SaaS Factory. So our team helps with the customers and partners who are building multi-tenanted SaaS solutions on AWS, and we kind of help them to build the solutions and go to market from both technical and the SaaS business standpoint. Apart from that, we put significant effort and investment in order to create the new content, build new reference architectures and design patterns to help our customers as repeatable content. As a result, we launched multiple reference architectures, one on EKS SaaS solution reference architectures, and one on serverless reference architectures, and we also have a separate dedicated framework that we have made open source called SaaS Boost as well. So we keep on building and innovating on behalf of our customers to make their lives easier in order to build SaaS on AWS as well. So that's about my team, and I myself have been primarily working with the technology partners across APAC region, helping them to build multi-tenant SaaS solutions with AWS managed services. Yeah, as Chris mentioned, I'm based out of Singapore. Super exciting to be in the show.
Wonderful. This is your third time, right?
Yes, this is my third appearance in the show. It's wonderful every time I be here. I really enjoy that.
Awesome. Kartik.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Great to be part of the show. So my name is Kartik Annamalai, and I'm a partner solutions architect here at AWS. And I'm based out of Chennai, India. So where I primarily focus on helping technology partners in India in their SaaS journey, where I work with these organizations to build solutions, multi-tenant SaaS applications aligning to the best practices on building SaaS. And as Damika mentioned, my specialty is SaaS, and myself and Damika as part of the same team, AWS SaaS Factory. And I'm super excited to be part of the show.
Awesome. So today's show specifically around federated user management. So Kartik, over to you. What is it? What is federated user or what is federated identity? And why is this important if you are building or running a SaaS?
Sure. See, the customers who often subscribe to SaaS offerings will have other applications already in place to cater for various business needs. So often these organizations will already have established mechanisms to authenticate and manage access to these applications. The more centralized the user management is, the lesser are the operational overhead. So typically, this is achieved using an identity and access management solution, which will be managed by the customer. So now, when these customers subscribe to SaaS offering from a vendor, right? So having one user credential for all their applications hosted in their data center, along with the SaaS services which they have subscribed for, is something the customers will prefer, right? So this is where the identity federation helps. So identity federations helps delegating the user authentication to an external third party. So the trust in this case could be between a SaaS provider and the tenant, where the user can basically log in using the identity provider of the tenant. So let me explain this using a diagram. If I could share my screen.
Yeah, let's have a look.
So in a federated environment with SaaS, so what basically happens is that the users of the tenant will basically authenticate using the identity provider of the tenant organization. And once the authentication is successful, it provides a token, right? And using this token, the client approaches the SaaS provider's IDP, which in turn trusts the. So I'm getting a feedback.
Oh, I can't hear anything. Might be just your
Okay,
mic.
cool. Uh, so the client just forwards this.
There's a short echo coming from to me
Yeah,
as well. I can hear Chris.
How's that? Any better?
uh, yeah, it's better now. Yeah,
Better?
maybe. Yeah. So once the user is authenticated with the identity provider of the SaaS organization, they receive a token from the identity provider, which is then forwarded to the identity provider of the SaaS application by the client. So this is where the trust, which is established as part of the federation, comes in, where the SaaS identity provider will trust the token and then issue an federated token to the client, which can be used by the client to access the SaaS services. Right. So having a capability to federate with an identity provider hosted by the tenant will give a SaaS provider a rich set of experience in logging in experience, where the tenant users can actually log in using their own identity provider and have a single user credential for all their access. So this is where the identity, federation really shines. So
Mm-hmm.
now identity federation is basically built on open standards, right? So it could be SAML, it could be OIDC, or OAuth 2.0. So SAML is basically an XML based protocol which handles both authentication and authorization in a federated space, wherein OIDC, which is more modern JSON based, it handles authentication alone in a federation space, and it is
Mm-hmm.
built on OAuth 2.0, which handles federation. Right? And when you think about the choice of protocols to use, it really depends on the identity providers which are getting federated and the support which they have for these protocols, right? And identity federation is a broad topic, right? So it really depends on the protocols and the identity providers which we are going to use as part of the two federation. For today's discussion, right? So let me focus on two specific identity providers, right? So let's take Amazon Cognito as the identity provider of a SaaS application, and we'll see how we can use the federation capabilities of Cognito to federate into a tenant who's hosting an Microsoft Active Directory as their IDP, right? So in this case, Cognito is an OIDC based IDP, and it federates into Active Directory using SAML. So we will discuss on the various flows which are involved as part of the SAML and the OIDC protocols to achieve the federation as we go through the show.
Awesome. Awesome. Now, Damika, um, this might be a good chance. So, Kartik, is there anything else you wanted to discuss before we talk about maybe some customer use cases here?
I think we are good. So I think we have given a good context on, basically from a business point of view as a SaaS provider, federation is something that you need to definitely have. And let's go through the use cases and take it out from there.
Okay. So, Damika, what
Yeah.
might help for our viewers is to talk through like what does this look like in the wild? Do we have customer examples where they've needed this? We obviously have, but are there some that can give viewers a good overview as to what this looks like in real life?
Yeah, certainly we do. In fact, we see these federated identity discussions are getting prioritized as a trend in our customer conversations daily basis as well with SaaS customers and partners. Uh,
Mm.
I can think of one of the customers that we helped, who is a global fintech company, providing the solutions for telco companies. For years, they had one of the managed services on e-commerce, and they wanted to kind of SaaSify that solution to be a multi-tenant SaaS platform on AWS. And when we think about the end or the tenants to whom the SaaS solution would be sold to, those would be telco companies. So these telcos generally they have identity centralized in their local environments with IDPs, and it made sense the most for this particular fintech company to integrate a federated identity component in their SaaS solution, so they could basically reuse the existing identity data with the tenants that they are going to onboard to the SaaS platform. So with that, the solution that Karthik outlined, we kind of helped them to implement it, and they went live with that. And most of the tenants who are telcos using the solution are being federated through Cognito, and then using the standard OIDC flow internally within the SaaS solution, using the same identity data of the tenants or the telcos today. One of the biggest advantage would be from tenant standpoint that they don't have to kind of duplicate the identity data just for the sake of getting into SaaS. They can kind of reuse what it is already in their domain, kind of integrate that to the SaaS application. So that's all what they need. Another example I can think of is one of the ASEAN-based insurance company who had been doing general and motor insurance on-prem for years. They kind of migrated the workload as a SaaS modernizing into a SaaS onto AWS. We helped them to build this. Even in that case, if you look at their end customers, major insurers who actually who have been with these identity providers locally, we kind of implemented the same mechanism with them. And this one was actually multi-region SaaS solution. So the regional deployments of the identity components for federating the tenants in that particular region, and then work together as a multi-region SaaS as well. So we find multiple use cases and customer use cases around the federated identity in our conversations very regularly these days.
Okay, lovely. Karthik, this is a golden opportunity now to actually go that one level deeper and look at a real architecture. So maybe let's have a look at an architecture that implements this federation.
Sure. Let me go through a sample architecture. So I'll use this diagram as a backdrop to explain basically how the federation works. So as I said, for today's discussion, we will be using Cognito and Active Directory as the two identity providers between which we are establishing the federation. Right. So here, basically the flow starts with the client trying to access the SaaS application. Right. So the SaaS application then forwards that request to its identity provider, right? So in this case, Cognito is configured as identity provider for the SaaS application. So the request kind of lands there. And in Cognito, since that we have configured federation with the tenant's identity providers, Cognito will have the intelligence to forward this request to the Active Directory. So now this is where the protocols kick in. Remember, I said the federation between Cognito and Active Directory is through SAML. Right. So here, as part of the flow 3 here, if you could see, it's basically the SAML specification. Cognito will fire a SAML authentication request, which is a standard schema of XML, which is being sent to the Active Directory. And Active Directory recognizes that request and basically allows the users to authenticate. Right. So as part of the authentication, the client will enter his credential. So once his authentication is successful, as part of the SAML response, Active Directory will respond back to Cognito with a SAML token, which is again a standard SAML structure of metadata containing the information about the authentication. With that token, since Cognito is now trusting Active Directory, it will further issue another token, which is accessible to the SaaS application, and then it forwards that to the client. Right? The client then uses that token. The token is basically called as a federated token to access a SaaS application. So this is how the entire end-to-end trusts work, where Cognito just forwards that request to Active Directory, the authentication happens there, and based on the trust build, the tokens get exchanged, and finally the user will be able to access the SaaS application. And in terms of the protocol flow, as I said, there are two. right? So between SaaS application and Cognito, as mentioned here, it is completely OIDC based flow. But when it comes to Cognito and Active Directory, the exchange is all SAML based.
I think in this design, you know, it's clear that how do you kind of uh, work together with the external IDPs for from Cognito standpoint. You send your users to authenticate to the external IDPs and get the response, and based on that, you allow to interact with the SaaS solution that we have. But from the SaaS, if you look at the SaaS providers or SaaS solution standpoint, we need a unique identifier to identify the request. Where does that, which tenant that particular request belong to? If you look at one user request, right? So this is where we kind of uh, get the things interested a little bit. So generally in a SaaS solution, we are believing on this one specific construct called tenant ID. When a new tenant is onboarded, we kind of assign a unique ID to that particular tenant, and we try to we generally try to keep it as a part of the identity context, identity as a part of the identity configuration of the user who's logging in, and then we let those users to kind of send that tenant context with, for example, with every request that they are sending to the SaaS solution. So not only the components in the architecture, but also the microservices downstream will consume that tenant ID for doing the tenant specific work. So doing the federation, which simplify the authentication from the external IDPs, but one of the challenges that we as architects and the developers need to work on is where and how we can inject or introduce a tenant ID during the tenant onboarding, and also where we can inject that tenant ID to the user response when a particular use is getting federated from IDP. So those are a couple of challenges, and we need to kind of look into the architecture and see where we can actually implement to get the tenant ID available for the end users who are getting federated from the external IDPs as well. So Karthik, I was wondering how we can handle these challenges. Are there any specific prescriptive guidance when it comes to the federated identity to inject the tenant ID, especially on tenant onboarding and the new user onboarding of a tenant?
Yeah, sure. So if you see, if the so far the flow which you have described, right, to basically federate Cognito and Active Directory, it yielded only the token, right? As Damika mentioned, for a SaaS application, in addition to the token being yielded by the identity provider, we also need to associate a tenant ID to the token, right? So this is where things get a bit complicated when it comes to a SaaS based application, because what happens is that as part of the SaaS application authentication experience, we need to inject the tenant context into the token. Now, in a federated setup, what happens is that the authentication is done as part of the tenant's IDP, who's not aware of what is there inside our SaaS application from a tenant context perspective, right? So now, as a SaaS provider, we need to have solutions and mechanisms in place to basically receive the token from the external IDP and then enrich it with the tenant context, which we need to further have other multi-tenancy and other things implemented within SaaS application. So let me go through a solution, right, which can be implemented in Cognito to achieve this introduction of tenant context. Um, so what basically happens is that as part of the federated setup, right? So once a user is logging in, right, um, Cognito will create a replica of the federated user within the directory, right? That's something which Cognito, provides out of the box. And also as a solution, while we are configuring uh, Cognito with Active Directory in a federation setup, when the tenant is getting onboarded, right, what happens is that every federation gets a unique identity. We call it as a provider name, right, which is configured in Cognito as part of the tenant onboarding process, which we use to map to the tenant ID.
Mm.
right? So this is basically a mapping which will help us to resolve the Active Directory tenant to the tenant ID which we maintain within the SaaS application, right? So when the user is logging in, right? Let's say a user is logging in, and as part of the uh, setup which is required to inject the tenant context, what we can leverage is that Cognito supports Lambda triggers, right? Which is basically a Lambda function which can be triggered at various points to extend the login workflow. Right? So what we are doing here is that we are using a specific trigger called post confirmation Lambda trigger, which will basically get triggered once a user is confirmed in the Cognito, right? So as I mentioned, when a Federated user logs in for the first time, Cognito automatically creates the user and confirms in the incognito. So obviously this trigger will get fired, right? And in this Lambda function, we can query the mapping table which we have created between the provider name and the tenant ID as part of the onboarding process, fetch the tenant ID, and then update the Cognito user detail with the tenant ID details, right? It could be tenant ID and other tenant specific, attributes which we require. So once we update the user with these attributes, any token which is getting created out of Cognito for this user will have the tenant and the user specific data as claims embedded. So using this solution, we are basically able to create a claim, which is basically a JWT OIDC based token, which has
Mm.
both tenant and the user context.
Awesome. Awesome. Now let's see if we can demo this, huh?
Yeah.
Sure, we can. Um,
3D pictures are
le-
great. Let's see if we can actually show how this works in real life.
sure. Uh, Let me log in. I'll just log in into console. Give me a minute.
Nice. Nice. Everyone loves watching the console. I love the tenseness of doing something live.
Yeah. I think there are series of steps you need to kind of implement
Mm,
to get this full workflow up and running. There are
Mhm.
certain configurations you got to do in the IDP when you want to integrate that to SaaS solution, and then
Yeah.
you need to kind of do some configurations within the SaaS solution within Cognito, and the special arrangements, as Karthik mentioned, to get it up and running for especially during the tenant onboarding time, to get the tenant ID created and then
Mhm.
populate that database that is showed. Uh, and once that is done, the system is ready for the user onboarding. So whenever the users of the new tenant is kind of onboarded through Federation,
Mhm.
they will automatically get the tenant ID injected through that flow, which is pretty automated flow. There is no manual intervention, and it's a good value that we can bring to a SaaS provider. And also, it's we need to careful a little bit in choosing the right Lambda function. There are different type of Lambda triggers that we can use to similar thing, like same thing done in Cognito, but this post confirmation Lambda will just free trigger only one time, so that you save a lot of Lambda calls.
Right. Right.
So let's take the demo in basically two steps, right? So I'll walk through starting with what is required at the Active Directory side to build the
Mhm.
federation and trust. Then we'll get into the Cognito side of things. So let me open up a Windows machine running Active Directory. So Active Directory as a product, right? It has two components. One is Microsoft Active Directory, which is basically a user directory where we maintain, where the organization basically maintains its entire, users. Right. So what we have done for this setup is that in Active Directory of the tenant, assuming that this is Active Directory of the tenant, we have
Mhm.
created two users for SaaS. So if you could see here, SaaS user 1 and SaaS user 2, which we will be using as part of the demo to do the federated login. Right. So the second component, which is part of the Active Directory suite, is the Active Directory Federation services. So this is the service which basically enables federation with other identity providers like Cognito by using standard protocols. So in this case, we will be using SAML. Okay. So this is the Active Directory Federation console. So when it comes to integration, right? So what we have to basically do is that every identity provider who's federating into Active Directory Federation services is considered as a relaying party. Okay, and we have to establish a trust for every relaying party which we are connecting. So if you could see here, I've created an relaying party called Organization X, which is basically the trust which we're trying to establish with the Cognito. There are multiple steps, to make this setup. But let me go through some of the key, settings which we have to perform. Right. So one of the key things is that in order for the Active Directory Federation services to recognize our Cognito user pool, we have
Mhm.
to share this identity, which is basically the ARN of the Cognito user pool pre-configured in ADFS. So that is one. The other thing is that once the let's say the user is authenticated, right? So once he is authenticated, uh, we need to instruct ADFS to forward the token to a specific endpoint, right? So that endpoint will be within Cognito, right?
Okay.
So within so that endpoint, whatever, sorry, one second. So that endpoint, whatever we are configured within Cognito, is something which we will be sharing to the ADFS. Okay.
Can you
So
can you show us where in Cognito you get those
yeah,
URLs?
I'll show you. Maybe
Okay.
let me finish this, then I'll go to Cognito and I'll explain the flow on the Cognito side on where to get those URLs.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So with these two configured, what happens is that we are kind of instructing ADFS that, hey, this is a relaying party, and once you've authenticated, forward this request to this endpoint. Right. So these are the two main steps. And one more key thing that we will configure as part of this setup is the claims. So what happens is that so basically in a Windows-based system, you have Active Directory where you have a lot of attributes stored for that particular user who's trying to log in. But from a SaaS provider perspective, we may not need everything, right? It could be some organization specific data. So what
Right.
we have to do is that we have to pick up what is required for us, right? Let's say in this sample, I've taken the name ID is the user ID and the email, right? I've just taken these two attributes alone and instructed ADFS to pass it on to Cognito.
Right.
Okay, so this is basically the setup on the ADFS side. So let me flip over to Cognito and see what is the setup which needs to be done there. Okay, so here we have an Cognito user pool. So the very first step that we need to do as part of the federation setup is to configure a federated identity provider, right? So this identity provider is what connects Cognito with the ADFS, right? If you
Mhm.
could see here, I've created an identity provider called ADFS. And what I've done is, um, like how we configured the endpoints with in ADFS with
Right.
details of the Cognito, ADFS also gives something called metadata.xml, right? Which is basically metadata about itself, which needs to be uploaded into Cognito so that Cognito can trust the ADFS, right? So let me show how a metadata XML looks like, which is provided by the ADFS system. So metadata basically has all the capabilities. It's an XML document, given that it's a SAML-based interaction, right? It basically shows all the capabilities of that particular ADFS integration, right? So it basically lists on what is your identity, what is the certificate you have to use to basically, sign and verify each other manually, and what are the various attributes that it can basically provide, right? So if you could see here, all these attribute things, these are all the list of user attributes that particular, Active Directory can potentially give to the Cognito Federation. But now for our federation, we've just taken two out of this, which is the Windows ID and the email. Right. So this file has to be basically uploaded into Cognito. I've already uploaded it. Right. And once this uploading is done, like how we did the attribute mapping, saying that I'm going to give you the email ID from my Active Directory, the similar mapping need to be done on the Cognito side also, right? So we have received the email ID. Where should I map that to in the user pool, right? So what I'm basically saying here as part of the attribute mapping is that this is a SAML uh, field which will contain the email ID of the user, and you have to map that to the email field of the user pool, right? So
Right.
once this setup is done, Cognito will be able to receive the token, validate it, and then map it to the email field of the user. It kind of creates that trusts and the mapping.
Mm-hmm.
So this is on creating the initial provider to basically establish the federation, right? So once that is done, the next step is that from an application point of view, what we have to do is that Cognito has something called user pool attributes, right? So remember we talk about the tenant context that needs to be injected into the user for authenticating himself into a SaaS application. So
Mm-hmm.
that has to be configured in Cognito as custom attributes, right? So when you say custom attributes, uh, what happen in Cognito, we have an option where we can extend the user attributes with some custom data, right? So if you could see here, I have added three custom attributes: tenant
Right.
ID, tenant tier. Yep, basically two, right? So I've added these custom attributes. So now what we'll do is that at runtime, right, when the customer is or the tenant user is logging in, we will populate these custom attributes via the solution which we just described, right, using the Lambda function. So let me go into that part.
Yeah, I
So we
think
have the
just wanted to also highlight the custom attributes are there for us to kind of customize the user pool or identity data that when you're saving the users in the incognito, and you have the standard attributes already in Cognito user pools when you're saving a user that is going with the OpenID Connect specification. For example, name, user, the username, email ID, etc. But any attribute that you want to save that is not on the OIDC spec, you can use these custom attributes to save them, such as tenant ID, the tier of the tenant, and etc. So that's what we are configuring here, and it's an important component in a SaaS solution to leverage custom attributes as necessary. Yeah, it's good to go through that tenant ID mapping, Karthik. So I think that's a core part of the setup
Mhm.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So now basically what we have done is we have done the required configuration to map the tenant ID to the user. Then in terms of how the user will access this Cognito user pool, we have to basically use an app client, right? App client in Cognito basically allows an application, in this case a SaaS application, to access the user pool data, right?
Mm.
So what we'll be doing is that we will be creating a new app client representing this federation between Cognito and Active Directory. Oh, and if you could see the configuration of the app client, what I've basically done here is that let me go through some key fields here. Um, so if you could see the attribute read and write permission section, uh, so what it basically says is that for this particular application, whenever I'm issuing a token, the claims can be filled with these data, right? So what we have done is that the custom attributes which we have added as part of the setup, tenant ID and tenant tier, we have given the read permissions. So what Cognito will do is when the token is getting created, it will basically read these values and then fill it in the claim, which is what we need to create the tenant and the user linkage. So this is one configuration. The other configuration is that once the token is created, where should it send? Cognito creates a token, but where the token need to be finally sent to, right? So in this case, it needs to be sent to a well-defined endpoint, which will normally be be defined as part of the application, right? So now, given that we are not setting up an actual application, I've given a dummy endpoint, right? So we call it as a callback URL, right? So this callback URL will be part of the SaaS application itself. It's like handing over the token to the application. So now for our demo, I've used a dummy URL, but we will be able to see the flows in the browser, on how these tokens are getting exchanged. I'll explain that, in bit a while. So with this hosted UI being set up, right, we are kind of done from a configuration perspective on what is required to establish a federation between Cognito and Active Directory. And maybe let's dive in and see how a user is actually able to log in, and let me go through the different flows which are getting exchanged between Cognito and Active Directory. I'll try to capture those tokens, and we'll decode that and see what is there inside. Shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
Sure,
Let's have a look.
absolutely. Before going there, do you want to quickly show the Lambda trigger as well, Karthik, to see where we can convert the identify the tenant request and map it to the tenant ID, please?
Sure. I'll show you that quickly. So this is a key point. So thanks, Damika. So what happens is that, as we mentioned, right? So when the user is logging in, so we have to hook a Lambda trigger, a post confirmation Lambda trigger to the Cognito, so that this can be fired for the very first time the user is logging in, which will basically take the care of updating the user with the tenant related detail, right? So I've created a dummy function here. It will not actually query any data source, but the idea here is, if I could go through the code.
I need waiting music or something.
Yeah, it's loaded now. Yeah. Okay. So I hope the font is visible.
Yep.
Can you zoom it a bit more? Yeah.
Better.
Yeah.
That's good.
So what I've done here as part of this demo code is I've just fired a direct update call to the Cognito user pool, asking to update these two attributes with some predefined values. But ideally what will happen in a real function is that before you fire a call, you will make a call here to that data source which has the mapping between the tenant provider name and the tenant ID. You get that detail and then make this call to this admin update user attribute, which will update the Cognito user pool with the details which are passing in this attribute, which is the tenant ID and the tenant tier. Okay. So yeah, let's get into a sample login. Okay. I'll get into the app client. Then I'll open the hosted UI. So hosted UI is basically an utility provided within Cognito, which helps to basically log in into Cognito applications. So as you could see here, what has happened is I click Cognito, but the screen which is shown here, right, it is actually the login page of the Active Directory. So if you see the URL, it is the ADFS.
Okay.
right? So let's see the flow, the what is exchanged as part of this, uh, redirection. I'll open the console and I'll just do a refresh. Right? So if you could see the very first call, uh, I'll I understand the font may be a bit uh, less for the viewers to see, but I'll open it in a new window so that it can be made more clearer. If I zoom it, it is not working out good. So yeah, is it better now?
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty good.
Okay, cool. So as you could see, as part of the call which is made from Cognito to the ADFS, there's something called SAML request, right? This
Yep.
this request is what is going to contain the information about what is required from the from the Fed ADFS service. Let me decode it. So if you could see there, so the key informations, right? So as we configured the two key fields, right? What is the URL to which the ADFS has to send back the token, which is pointing to Cognito, and then the identifier. Remember, we configured one identifier in the ADFS
Mm-hmm.
console, which was basically pointing to the Cognito ARN, right? And the same
Yep.
ARN is passed as part of the request. So this using these, ADFS will validate and then show the login screen for the user to enter his credential, right? So let me go ahead and enter a credential. So I've created two users, SaaS user 1 and SaaS user 2. I'll log in as SaaS user 1. Okay, cool. So it has happened so quick, but let me explain the flow, what is happening. Before coming into this page, we are having trouble. Let me go through the other, the flow which has happened. Now, what has actually happened is user has been authenticated, right? Then ADFS has transferred the control back to Cognito via
Mhm.
SAML response. And then Cognito has synthesized the token and it has actually forwarded that, the federated token again back to the callback URL which you have configured. Remember, I
Mhm.
said about the where to hand over the token to. So for
Yep.
our demo, we've just configured with some dummy URL test. Right, this will ideally be the endpoint which is part of the SaaS application. So since it's the dummy URL, it is showing an error saying that I'm not able to find the site, but that is okay. But what is more important is this access token, right? So we'll go through this token in a while. But before getting into the access token part of it, let us go through the SAML response, which is the response from the uh, um, ADFS back to Cognito. So if we could see here, the response from ADFS is having a field called SAML response, right?
Mhm.
Which basically contains the information about the authenticated users. So
Right.
let's try decoding this. Yeah.
Oh,
So
nice.
this XML schema, right? If you could see, let me go through some key fields, right? So the one which we are interested to understand is that what are the user attributes which is getting exchanged. If you could see here, there are two things. Remember the name ID which we configured that is
Mhm.
getting passed, right? And we also configured the email to be passed as part of the response. And we should find an email somewhere here. Yes, here, right? So these are the user attributes which we asked the ADFS to exchange with Cognito, and it has done that. These two user attributes, and apart from
Right.
that, it has some other additional, certificates and other things which will be used by the Cognito to validate the integrity of this token, right? Fine. So now the token is passed to Cognito, and Cognito has validated this token using the signature. It has taken these fields, right? And what it has done is, the next step, what it will do is it will create a user within the Cognito user pool to represent the federated user. Let me show that. See, ADFS SaaS user one. So this is a user which we use to log in, and it is automatically created within the Cognito user pool as part of the login process. And the important thing to observe here is the custom attributes. So these are the custom attributes which we configured as part of the setup, and now it is populated with the values tenant
Right.
100 premium. So these values are actually supplied by your Lambda function. See
Yeah.
here, I've hard coded these two values here, and that is what is getting updated as part of the completion. So now when the user is logging in, the access token which is getting generated will have these attributes as claims. I've already generated the access token. Let me decode that. Let me.
I think that was the key part here, to federate a user from IDP, and then get the user created in the Cognito with the relevant fields populated. So from there onwards, it's the standard IDC flow within SaaS application to convert those the use attributes, the custom attributes into ID token and the access token, and then we can actually move ahead with the standard SaaS flow within the application. So any downstream components, microservices will consume these ID token to extract the data of the user, and also to extract the tenant ID.
Yeah. So I've taken the access token, which is passed in this URL. Let me paste it and see how it is getting decoded. Excellent. So this is the final access token which got generated. And the key thing to note here is that we have these tenant attributes, tenant ID as a claim embedded in this token. So by doing this, what we are basically achieving is that we are introducing the tenant context as part of the user authentication experience, which is what is required in a SaaS-based application.
Awesome, Karthik. This is great. I mean, this is incredibly helpful for people who want to know how to do this with Cognito, and ultimately just how simple it is to do.
Yep.
Right, particularly when you're starting to do multi-tenant SaaS, like this is very, very straightforward to start getting having an understanding of how to really do multi-tenancy in a simple way. At least when it comes to user identity. We are very quickly running into the end of our hour. I do have one question though, and maybe Damika, it's worth you talking about this one. There'll be a number of questions that we don't have time for, but there is one that particularly around, because Karthik talked about user pool. Can you very briefly talk about what are the differences between like a single user pool, multiple user pools in this federated setup?
Yeah, so it's a very classic comparison. The single user pool versus multiple user pool in a SaaS solution, but within the federated setup like this, one of the things to remember is when you're choosing the federated identity, you need to define where you are going to store the user identities, like user data. You can choose one user pool or multiple user pools, right? So what I see working with the customers is that based on their requirements, their identity requirements, isolation requirement, some some choose single user pool, and some choose the multiple user pool, where you have a dedicated user pool per tenant. So you kind of federate different tenants into their own user pools. Now, when you have a single user pool, it's a great way to get started. One thing to remember is that there are account level quotas, and any kind of API level limitations and stuff like that. You want to kind of remember. For example, if you are using a lot of custom attributes, you can have only about 50 custom attributes per user pool in those kind of situations. And if you want to kind of customize the experience, we are for example, tenant-wise domains, if you want to introduce, or if you want to customize the multi-factor authentications tenant-wise, it's better to choose a user pool per tenant, so that you can have that level of customization abilities. So that's really based on the use case. What I see the most is, like, most of the customers, when you really want to go live, because of the go-to-market priorities, they just use one user pool and go live, and then have a then kind of change the identity model to have single user pools if there is more or better isolation models.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Look, I think we've run out of time, and it's a good point for us to close out today. Firstly, I want to say, Kartik, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. You have described here something not just useful, but incredibly succinct as well. So I think there's a lot of people that will see this and find this very useful. So thank you for your time. Damika, always a pleasure. And thank you for explaining these things as well. So for anyone who is watching and you want more info, or you want help on this, feel free to get in touch with your AWS account teams, who can also get in touch with the SaaS Factory team as well. But the understanding of SaaS and federated user identity is pretty common. So you should be able to get help anywhere within AWS. I will put this link about SaaS identity best practices, if I can figure out how to copy and paste. Nope, that's not it. Copy paste skills. All right. Or feel free to get in touch with any of us, either through LinkedIn, or if you know us through your account teams as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kartik. Thank you, Damika.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, everyone else, for tuning into a LinkedIn Live experiment. Hopefully it worked. And hopefully we will see everyone else for building SaaS and AWS next time, ideally in the next 2 weeks, either on Twitch or back here on LinkedIn Live. So thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you.